Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Ormond. I'm a consultant with the Four Corners Wind Resource Center. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Since you all were on time, we're going to go ahead and get started. This webinar is called Wind Energy, a Good Citizen of the Electric Grid. Really pleased to have two of the folks that I think are the top expert in wind and renewable energy integration in the country with us this afternoon. We're going to have two presentations. Our first speaker is going to be Mark Ahlstrom. Mark's the founder and CEO of several different technology companies. For the last 15 years, he's been the CEO of WindLogic, who I believe is one of the nation's leaders. Well, it is the nation's leader in applied meteorology, wind energy analysis and forecasting, as well as integration. Mark has served as a technical advisor to a lot of different leading organizations in renewable energy, including the Utility Variable Generation Integration Group, known as UVIG, ICAAA, which is the National Electrical Standard Setting Body, AWEA, and also the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. So we're going to hear from Mark first, and then we're going to hear from Jim Caldwell, who I'm going to introduce now. Jim is the Senior Technical Consultant to CERT, the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technology. Jim has 50 years of experience in the energy industry, in both academic and the industry. For the last 30 years, he specialized in renewable energy technology and project development, and I don't think we know many people that can say that. He has worked in the past for Atlantic Richfield. He's had key positions in Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and he has worked as a technical advisor to trade associations and DOE and a host of other organizations. So we're really pleased to have both these gentlemen with us today. So we're going to start off with Mark Ahlstrom, who's going to provide kind of an overview of some of the things that wind technology can do and renewable energy technology can do. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Mark.
Thank you, Amanda. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'm going to give you some of my views around best practices of integrating wind and where it's going in terms of future reliability support from wind as well. As Amanda mentioned, you know, the group WindLogic that I'm with, we really started out helping wind project developers do a much better job by applying a lot of meteorology and weather modeling to the problem. We were acquired by NextEra Energy Resources in 2006, and today we've become really an analytics shop. Our mission is forecasting and optimization solutions to enable low-cost, reliable, and sustainable power systems. So we're working throughout the whole spectrum now, especially around integrating renewable energy. Our parent company, NextEra Energy, is the largest owner, operator, developer of wind in the country. So a fair number of the projects that you see around are actually developed and operated by NextEra. In terms of integration, we often think that wind is some sort of very different beast. When you actually look at a lot of our conventional generators, like coal plants and gas turbines and so forth, it turns out they all have a lot of quirks. We become pretty used to these, but for example, with a lot of these like large coal plants, you have to start it up a day ahead if you're going to want to run it today. So you can't just start them up on a dime. Once you start plants like this, they have to run for a certain number of hours before you can even think about shutting them down without damage. And once they're started as well, they have just a limited operating range. So it's kind of chunky. If I start this plant, I need to run it at least half of its maximum output all the time, and then I can ramp up above that. But the rate at which I can ramp will also tend to be fairly small. So it can't be moved around on a dime. With wind energy, it's a different problem because we're really driven by the characteristics of our fuel source, and the wind, of course, is driven by the weather. And so we have this sort of variability and the challenge of forecasting exactly how much the output will be at a given point. So that tends to drive it. But it's much a case of that. It's still challenging, but in a just a kind of a question of degree. It's not a totally unique problem. In fact, the way that a lot of this is dealt with, to take all of these different types of generators and mesh them into a system that can match the amount of generation we need at any point in time, is really done through what they call the process of unit commitment and dispatch. And what I mean by that is that unit commitment is often in the day ahead time frame, where you are figuring out, what is my load going to be tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and then I have to make sure I have the right set of plants available to me, and some of those plants I might have to start today. Now, once I get to real time, where I'm getting close to 1 o'clock, then I use a process called dispatch, which is, a lot of people, you'll hear about, well, this plant is dispatchable, and ironically, people often talk about nuclear plants as dispatchable. And a lot of people think that means, well, I can turn the dial to whatever I want at any point in time. And that's not really the case at all. We just talked about these constraints. Dispatch is not just arbitrarily turning the dial. It's really looking at all the different generators that are available to you and optimizing those by moving them around through usually a 5-minute adjustment process called dispatch, in order to get a perfect match between the amount of generation that I have and the amount of load that I'm trying to meet. Now, it turns out that wind actually is very dispatchable. In fact, all of the market regions that are sometimes called independent system operators, ISOs, are dispatching wind in one form or another today. And they actually include wind using a forecast in the day ahead unit commitment, so they look at the total mix of generators they'll have available. And then they're often giving wind a 5-minute dispatch set point, an instruction about here's how much I expect to get from you for this 5-minute period. Well, how do they do that if wind is so difficult to forecast precisely? Well, it turns out that forecasting wind day ahead is much like the weather forecast on TV, but forecasting wind for the next 5 minutes is actually a lot easier. Why is that? It's because wind actually has a lot of mass. The air is very heavy when you really look at it, and you are then spreading this across dozens of turbines that are covering many square miles. And it turns out that inertia of that mass of air and the smoothing you get over the wind turbines in a plant actually means that the output of a wind plant is quite smooth and quite stable. If it's producing 100 megawatts right now, I'm pretty sure it's going to be producing almost 100 megawatts 10 minutes from now, for example. So that's what's called a persistence forecast. It's just assuming that whatever it's doing now is going to continue to happen, and that works surprisingly well for wind, especially if you are doing that within the next 5-10 minutes. It's a very good forecast, and that's how these ISOs are actually using it in the 5-minute period. Now, they can turn wind down if they have a reason for doing so by dispatching it to a lower point, and wind plants can follow that change very, very quickly. The thing to keep in mind is that wind turbines are among the most modern of the generators on the fleet, and because they run with state-of-the-art power electronics and state-of-the-art controls, they can follow that dispatch point very precisely. Obviously, you're limited by the total amount of energy you get from the wind in that period, but you can do up to that level or anything below it very, very precisely. So this is really one of the best practices that has come out of a large body of integration studies that have been done. There's need for shorter scheduling intervals and to dispatch all generation into these shorter intervals. Other ones that Jim will be highlighting in a few minutes as well is that it helps to use a larger balancing area, because the error of forecasting one single wind plant, like in the day ahead time frame, will still have a fair amount of uncertainty around it. But a lot of that is just the forecast kind of random errors, that will tend to average out. So by just aggregating, say, a dozen wind plants over a state, I can reduce that total forecasting error by about half. So one of the best ways to make wind more predictable and have lower uncertainty is to use larger balancing areas. Obviously, though, if we're going to optimize the whole system, we want to get more flexibility from everything on the system, both conventional plants and the wind plants. And we want to integrate these forecasts for wind into our day ahead and our real-time plans, as we described, because you can't pretend it's not there. We're getting enough on the system where you have to forecast it, and you have to know how much wind you expect to be there and work around that. And Jim will be talking more about some of the other causes and incentives about the system and flexibility. In many cases we have flexibility out there, but because of maybe contracts or market rules, we're not using everything that's even available to us. So that's kind of when things are just operating normally, we just do that sort of dispatch process. But as a system operator, you also have to think about how am I going to make sure that the system stays reliable even when things go wrong. For example, we call these a disturbance. You know, if you unexpectedly lose a large generator like a big coal plant or nuclear plant or a big transmission line, you have to make sure that you can automatically adjust for that and keep the lights on. And that basically falls into three sorts of categories. One is that we need to keep the frequency very close to 60 hertz here in North America. You know, if we deviate from that, it causes damage to lots of types of motors and other equipment. We have to also control the voltage and keep it at, you know, within the right range, because the voltage control allows that energy to move around the system efficiently and is also needed to protect equipment. And you have to make sure that even if something does go wrong, that the generators that you need to provide frequency, voltage, and the power for the future periods stays connected to the grid. You don't want it to automatically disconnect just because there was a little dip in frequency for a few seconds. So these are often called reliability services. And this gets into a lot of the work that's being done by NERC, the organization that controls the reliability standards and so forth. Let me explain, you know, just what a disturbance is, because maybe you've not thought about this. But if we're starting out here at 60 hertz, as you see on the left, if I suddenly lose a large plant, which can happen in a fraction of a second, frequency immediately starts to dip because now I don't have enough generation to meet my demand, to meet load. And so it kind of, you know, slows down the other generators and the frequency starts to fall. Well, it's important that you have some generators there on the system that will automatically detect that drop in frequency and very, very quickly start injecting additional power into the system to slow down that rate of fall, turn it around so it's coming back the other direction, and get to a stable point. And you're talking here just in a few seconds, so a lot of this has to be kind of automatic or pre-programmed into the generators out there, that they are automatically watching frequency and responding in this way. This is often called inertia, or in the very fastest sense, or primary frequency response in the next few seconds. Now, after you have that automatic, you know, pre-programmed sort of response, then you can start adding additional power through instructions that come from the system operator out to the generators through what they call automatic generator control. It's every few seconds, or getting into the 5-minute dispatch process and putting more generation on. And that allows you to push the whole system back to the 60 hertz frequency. It turns out that wind plants actually can do all of this very, very well. We haven't always been asking them to do it because we've mainly just been looking at earlier wind plants, you know, as a source of clean energy, and not so much detailed control of the power, you know, the instantaneous sort of delivery of that energy. But you know, all modern wind plants now are and have been for years providing voltage support to maintain voltage at the correct level where they're connected. That's basically a standard feature in all of today's wind plants. They have the capability of also providing that sort of automatic primary frequency response that we just saw. In fact, this is already in place in Texas and the grid down there, and it's an option you can get for any new wind turbine, essentially. You can even get what they call synthetic inertia, which is interesting. For example, if I'm already producing as much power as the wind will allow me to, then I don't have additional power to use for primary frequency response to nudge it back up even further. Well, it turns out if you're on a system like in Hydro-Quebec, where they actually thought they wanted more of this very quickly, you know, sub-second kind of injection of power, you can even do that with a wind turbine because the spinning blades and generator of the turbine itself have a lot of inertia. They're pretty heavy, and you can take that kinetic energy, and with the right electronics, you can turn that into a quick burst of additional power, even if you're already producing, you know, your maximum power output and having back down to save room for that. You know, so that's available as well. Now, all of these are, you know, these do have some additional costs, or they may cut down on the amount of regular energy you sell to the grid. So you don't want to use them, you know, without coordinating with all the other generators on your system to make sure you're using the best ones at the current time to get what you need. You know, but the capabilities are there, and there's a lot of discussion right now around, should wind at least be installed to have these capabilities, and then should there be some sort of market products or payments, to allow wind to be provided to the system as well. So the key point to take away here is that, wind plants really are power plants. They are dispatchable, as long as you do it right with a very short-term forecast, like 10 minutes ahead or less. You can very well fit these into the 5-minute dispatch and expect wind to follow that quite closely. They ride through disturbances extremely well. The voltage can go all the way down to 0 volts, for a period of time, and the wind turbines will stay connected and help the system after that as well. They can provide frequency response and voltage control and do it very quickly, very accurately. And they actually can ramp and adjust their output faster than just about any other thing on the grid. You can go all the way from 0 volts all the way to the maximum that you have wind for in a fraction of a second if you want. And in fact, in some cases, they actually slow down wind in terms of limiting its ramp rate, because that's so much faster than a conventional unit that they have to be ready for that. Finally, I just wanted to put in a plug here that if these are the sort of things that you really are interested in from a fairly technical point of view, Amanda mentioned the organization called the Utility Variable Generation Integration Group, UVIG, and the website is shown here on the screen, uvig.org. This is where a lot of the utilities and system operators and consultants and weather forecasters and market designers go and have literally 2 or 3 days of in-depth discussion around these topics. Next meeting is coming up in April in Sacramento. And so if you're a utility or a co-op or somebody who is really interested in kind of the engineering and technical issues around integration of renewables, UVIG is certainly a resource at their website, and you might want to consider checking out some of their meetings and attending. So with that, I will turn it over to Jim and go into a lot more detail around some of these issues in a real study. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, very much. We're going to take a couple questions. I have a couple that came in, and I think I have one question on the webinar. If you are interested in asking a question, we're going to take a couple questions now, and then we're going to take some more at the end. Either raise your hand or click the question button, or please feel free to type your question into the chat box. So a couple here. One is, when you were talking about that wind has capabilities for dynamic reactive power, frequency response, and synthetic inertia, you said that there's additional cost to be able to access these services. So the question is, how do these costs for capitalizing on these services from wind compare to the cost from other technologies, other resources?
Sure. The incremental cost of installing these features in a new wind turbine, if you're planning ahead for it and you're doing it for a new one you're building, the cost of adding these features is fairly small today. It's something, but it might increase the cost of the turbine by 1 or 2%. The real cost, though, is in your real-time operations. I mean, obviously, in most cases, wind is under a contract or used by a utility to deliver as much clean energy as possible to the grid. So you're trying to usually max out your delivery of energy, the kilowatt hours that we need. And if you have to reduce the amount of energy you're delivering in order to save headroom, to save additional output, like for ramping up or for primary frequency response in that upward direction, then that would reduce the amount of energy that you're selling and getting paid for. So there would be a cost, what they call an opportunity cost, of basically lowering the amount of energy you're delivering, on a normal basis in order to have that capability. So you don't want to do that unless you really have a value in doing that, and maybe you would get, in the future, you would get paid in another way for doing that would make it worthwhile. But under current contracts and current usage, usually you would not want to pay that cost, as long as the system could get those reliability services from some other type of generator. Other sorts of responses don't have much of a cost. Like the voltage support, typically does not have a high cost, and so that's usually provided all the time by wind plants as well.
Okay, sounds good. Now I have tried to unmute Kelly Francone's phone. So Kelly, if you're with us, do you want to ask your question? Okay, I'm muting her again, and I'm going to see if Sarah Probst wants to ask a question.
Hey, Amanda. I had a couple of questions. One was whether dispatchability for wind is different in the WEC than in an RTO.
Well, it certainly doesn't have to be. I mean, as I pointed out in the slide, or maybe I didn't point it out at the bottom, you don't have to be in a market region to do a dispatch. I mean, every utility operator is doing some sort of, real-time fine-tuning. Sometimes it's a lot faster than 5 minutes. In some regions, I think, including WEC, actually do it, much more quickly in the order of seconds. So the issue is, not all regions expect wind to follow a dispatch or give wind a dispatch set point that they're supposed to follow. Some of the older wind plants, of course, didn't really have the capability of following that because that does take additional equipment and communications to get that signal from the system operator and then respond to it. But most of the new wind plants being installed today going forward are installed with that capability. And in some of the regions of the country, you have kind of a differentiation where, like, old plants maybe before 2005 or whatever, are not assumed to have that capability, but most of the newer ones are encouraged to install it and to be under some sort of market rule or contract, where they can respond to dispatch, if necessary. Now, usually, of course, you're still going to want to get as much energy as possible from wind plants in most cases because it's usually the cheapest, as well as cleanest energy you have available, so you tend to want to use as much of it as you can. But it is nice to be able to back them down if it's an emergency situation and it's really necessary, to do that.
Right. So I'm going to ask a question that came in on the chat box, and then I'm going to try to unmute. I don't know if it's Miss or Mr. Amu. So one that came in on the chat box relates, it looks like it's kind of a state-based question. They're asking about, are there market rules that individual states could adopt to increase access to wind's flexibility? Because you had made a statement earlier, I think, about that wind has a lot of flexibility, but the market rules aren't necessarily in place to access it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, most of the wind so far has been built to, often to meet a state portfolio standard, where you want to get to a certain percentage of wind, or various, motivations like that. And under those sort of rules, you're really just counting the megawatt hours of wind. What's the energy you're getting from wind, and you're not really assigning a value to some of these other services or the ability to quickly ramp or to provide these other services. You can do it. You kind of have to change, in some cases, the motivations that you're giving, to the utility or the, whoever is buying this wind, and assigning some sort of value, because it's no different than any other contract. You're going to do what you're paid to do. So in some of the market regions now, there's move to actually create new, what they call ancillary services products, meaning in addition to just buying the energy, I will also have a market product where I will pay you for a certain amount of this sort of fast ramping or these other, potentially these other reliability services at some point. And then if you have multiple revenue streams, as you are starting to have in some of these market regions, you can certainly do that through the market. States could do it directly, but in most cases the state is not, directly running their own market.
Okay, great. I realized that people who had little question marks instead of their hand raised actually had typed their question. So this is a learning curve for me. So I'm going to go ahead and read Kelly's question, and it's, what does it mean to have wind ride-through requirements? How does that exceed conventional power? So ride-through requirements.
Sure. Well, ride-through, of course, first means that if I have a deviation in my frequency or my voltage, that the wind plant will not disconnect from the grid, and it will stay synchronized and connected to the grid, And the most conventional plants also can do this to a degree, although you often have certain components, like within a conventional thermal plant, that will be impacted, like if the voltage goes to zero for a fraction of a second, even though they're what they call their relay protective settings, that are connecting it with the grid, kind of the fuses there. Even though those may ride through, it doesn't mean that some of the motors and equipment inside the plant will necessarily ride through. So with wind, they actually have requirements that are even more strict than for conventional thermal plants. And wind has to be able to survive a zero voltage event of several cycles and then ride through and still be there. So this took some doing with how you design a wind plant, how you do the electronics and so forth. But it has been tested out, and it's now a standard basically for all new wind turbines.
Okay, great. I have one or two more questions on the chat box, but I think that they will be good for both you and Jim to answer. So I'd like to go ahead and move on to Jim Caldwell, who's going to talk through the low carbon grid study. So Mark, thank you very much, but stay tuned because some of these questions are going to be for you too.
Sure, thanks.
This is Jim Caldwell. I assume everybody can hear me.
Yep, you're coming through well. Thank you.
Okay. So while we're making this transition, let me just make a couple of quick points sort of as a transition. And one is that in California, we're somewhat unique in that there is a relatively large fraction of the wind turbines that are 30 years and more old. And those turbines, those first generation turbines, can't do all the marvelous things that Mark talked about. And so to the extent that people look at the history and look at, they want to see something that's been going on for several years, they all look to California. And so one of the problems is when they look to California, they see that we can't do all of that with the wind. And so even though you tell them that the new wind turbines can do all these marvelous things, they don't believe it because they don't see it in the history. And that's one of the problems that we have. And I guess the other point I would make along that line is that as we go forward and as you get to larger and larger penetrations of wind and solar and other renewable and variable energy, the market system itself needs to adapt. And so many times it's not the physics, it's not the steel in the ground, it's not the products that are having trouble adapting, it's the markets themselves. And the flexibility that we're asking from them, what we really need is flexibility in the 6 inches between our ears, as opposed to the flexibility that can be built into many of these resources. So as we move forward as a society or as a balancing authority or as a region to rely more and more and more on renewables, we're all going to have to get outside of our comfort zone, and the people who have been operating the grid for the past 100 years are going to have to change. And that transition, that mental and emotional transition, is sometimes much more difficult than the physical transition that we talk about. For some reason, I'm still having trouble controlling my slides. I can't get to the forward, so I might have to ask Graham or somebody to try to advance them for me.
Just say next and we'll take care of it, Jim.
Next? Yeah. Now, this presentation is an hour-long presentation, and I put it up mainly so that everybody could see the whole thing. But I'm going to really whiz through pieces of it, and we can come back. And what I'm going to try to do is take some of the generic and theoretical things that Mark said and both illustrate how they work in practice, and secondly, really to try to discuss what California's grid is going to look like in 2030 assuming that we achieve all the policy objectives that we now have, and to talk about how that then sets us up for something that's even deeper penetrations in the 2050 time frame. So next, please. Okay, next. I'm going to whiz through a lot of the fronts. Okay, this slide illustrates the issue. The line that you see there is the trajectory of carbon emissions from basically today out to 2050. And that line represents California's AB 32, Governor Brown's pronouncements about where California is headed between now and 2050. And that's an 80% reduction from 2012 levels by 2050. Coincidentally, 2012 is about the same as 1990 in California. So this represents the trajectory of emissions. And the study that we're talking about is the study of the grid in 2030. And then we show 4 dots along that graph there in 2030. And the yellow dot on top would assume that there is no new policy initiatives or no new real impetus to reduce carbon past 2020. That's 33% by 2020. That's sort of current policy before the recent legislation. And emissions can trend down a little bit. That's because there's going to be a fair number of coal retirements in the West, regardless of whether there's a clean power plan or an SB 350 or a big greenhouse gas emission reduction. It also because the gas fleet, especially in California, is going to get much more efficient than it is today. And that's really because of in California, the way the trigger was the so-called once-through cooling rules, where all of the Korean War era gas plants are being retired and are being replaced with modern, more efficient gas plants. So we're really coasting from 2020, and we coast downward. But to the extent that we're trying to achieve the policy objectives of deep carbon reductions, we have to do a lot more. So the other 3 dots out there in 2030, the red, the green, and the blue, represent 3 scenarios that we'll be discussing going forward here. The red and the green dot are 2 different ways of getting to the next policy objective, which is basically 50% less carbon than what we have today, or something on the order of a 50% RPS. Precisely, these are a little bit beyond 50%. These look at a 56 to 58% RPS, and that extra kick over the 50% objective is really to make up for the fact that there's a nuclear plant in California that's going to be retiring in that time frame as well. And so if we're going to hold to the carbon emission reductions, we have to replace that energy with more renewables as well. So red and the green are really looking at a couple of ways of that 50% reduction. The blue is about as far as we think we can go with current technology in sort of the current system design, that we can't really go much below that without doing something different. And so what we did in this study is look at that just to make sure that there wasn't some cliff lurking beyond the 50%, that if we went to 52% or something like that, that we would run into a lot of trouble. But the point of this is, and we'll get back to this right at the end, that with current technology, current resources, we really can't get all the way to an 80% reduction, but we can get fairly close. We can get to a 66, 70% reduction, really without inventing any new technology, without inventing any new paradigm for how we deal with electricity. And the rate impact of doing that at least in California, depends strongly on natural gas prices, future natural gas prices. At the projections of future natural gas prices, the rate impact is extremely modest. So next, please. Let's go to the next one here, because again, I'm trying not to. And next, please. Okay, these are some of the things that are going to be happening between 2015 and 2030, almost regardless of a policy initiative to reduce carbon. So the first thing that's going on is that by that point in time, there in all likelihood will be a WEC-wide energy imbalance market with some sort of a day-ahead market. We're not talking about a West-wide RTO or ISO or CAL-ISO taking over the West. What we're saying is the current market trends for cooperation amongst the balance of the 38 balancing authorities in the West, that there will be a WEC-wide EIM with a day-ahead market, and there will be robust trading across those existing balancing authority lines. But we're not talking about, in this study, a WEC-wide RTO. Second big thing, roughly 1/3 of the coal fleet, plus the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant, plus, as I said, that OTC gas fleet, will be retiring in 2030 or before 2030. And that's going to yield a much more efficient and nimble gas fleet than what we have today. That next one is something that's relative to California, and that is, again, back to some of the legacy things that we did in the 1980s to, in this case, combined heat and power or cogeneration. A lot of those facilities are going to be repowered, re-upped in a way that makes them much more efficient. There's going to be significant transmission added to the WEC backbone. The west of Devers line, which is in California, it's an east-west bottleneck in California. Gates-Gregg is a north-south bottleneck in California. Those two additional transmission things have been approved, and they're in permitting or under construction at this point. The SWIP line, which is a north-south bottleneck from southern Idaho to Nevada, that is being talked about, but at this point it has not yet been approved. But in this study, we assume that it has been approved and happened, and that's an important piece of new transmission, but that's about all that we need in order to get to these levels. We haven't talked about rooftop solar, but we assume in this study that the explosive growth in rooftop solar, or the 3-4 kilowatts that goes on people's roofs, continues, and it reaches something like 7 to 10% of retail sales by 2030. Now that's roughly 10 times how much of that solar is out there today, and once you get to that level, you're beginning to saturate that the number of roofs, or the number of the amount of space that you have at this level in order to put solar panels on, that you're either eating into real estate that you could use for something else, or you're putting it in places where through shading or just breakup, or that it really is a suboptimal installation of new solar. So all of these things are going to happen in 2030 to 2050, and they're in all of the cases that we're looking at going forward. We have an aggressive electric vehicle program, 3.3 million electric vehicles by 2030, and we're forecasting for gas price increases from the roughly $2.50 to $3 level that you see today, and the consensus forecast for 2030 is somewhere between $5 and $8 for gas. Next, please. So these are some of the resource portfolios, and we've listed them here by energy and also by capacity, depending on how you do it. And the two cases that we look at here, one we call the target case and one we call the high solar case. And in contrast to what Mark was talking about in his presentation, all of these scenarios call for a very significant increase in solar, mostly solar photovoltaics, as well as wind. And so the total energy, that's the total out there in 2030. The incremental energy is the amount that we would be adding from 2020 to 2030 in order to achieve those carbon reductions. So you're getting to roughly half of the new additions being solar in the high solar case, about a third or so solar in the target case, and you can see a significant chunk of wind, but also a significant chunk of geothermal, which California has in abundance, and just a little bit of biomass. So next, please. That's the same incremental by capacity as opposed to energy, so these are in megawatts instead of megawatt hours, and you can see that in terms of megawatts or the capacity, that solar is a very large fraction of the new added renewables, more so from a capacity standpoint than an energy standpoint, because the capacity factor of new solar is much lower. And so wind and solar take up much of the new capacity. Next, please. This is a rather important detail, if you will, and it's the difference. What we're going to get to is the difference between those the green and the red dots in 2030. And that first red dot talks about conventional flexibility, and the green dot looks at enhanced flexibility. And these are really different ways of thinking about contracts, different ways in which we deal with ancillary services, different ways in which we import and export, and how we trade. And without getting into the details here, case A, or the conventional flexibility, is the way we do it today. Case B, or enhanced flexibility, is the way we can do it based upon the physical capability of these resources, but we're going to have to change the way we think about this. We're going to have to change contracts. We're going to have to change a lot of things in order to make this happen. And the key here is that this is really important. These are details, but they're important details. And next, please. The difference between doing those we show graphically here. Now, this is what is called a duration curve, and if you look at the number of hours in the year, there's 8,760 hours in a year, 24 more in leap year, but if we do all of those things that we physically have the capability to do today, if we utilize the resources that we have and that we're going to be buying in the way that they can be done physically, then we're going to have a system which has very little curtailment. You can see that there are a few hours out of the year, and here let's just say that curtailment is the same thing as what Mark called dispatch. That this is where you could generate energy from the wind and the solar, but you choose not to in order to balance the system. And as Mark was saying, that is expensive, not because it costs a lot of money to do that, but because if you curtail the output, if you dispatch the output down, then you've bought all of that energy, and then you're essentially throwing it away. If you do that with gas plants, as we do today, then at least you save all the fuel cost. And so it's much cheaper to dispatch a system with the fuel costs and saving the fuel cost. And that's the way the market is organized today, to save that fuel cost through dispatch. But everybody dispatches all the time, and everybody will in the future in order to have a reliable grid. But if you get to a point where you are dispatching the wind and the solar a lot, then you get the green curve instead of the blue curve. And the difference between those two curves is, just for California, is over $1 billion a year in lost fuel savings. And then in terms of carbon emissions, almost 8 million tons of CO2, or some 8% of the difference, or of the amount of carbon emissions that we have in today's grid, that you lose by not taking these flexible initiatives to change where we go. So next, please. These are the costs that we're looking at. The net cost as a percentage of the revenue requirement, or the utility expenses, out in the year 2030. If we procure a diverse set of new renewables, and if we have those enhanced flexibility changes, then it's essentially a break-even, or 0.6% increase in costs. And as we go down that list, the less diverse portfolio, but those enhancements, have a 2% increase in cost. The conventional, if we don't change the way we operate the grid today, but we procure that diverse portfolio, you're looking at a 2% increase in cost. If you have the high solar and conventional, then you have a 4% increase in cost. If we factor in issues like differences in gas prices, then I think we can say that the rate impacts of these kinds of these levels are somewhere between 2 or 3% downward pressure on rates to something like 10% increase in rates as we go forward. And those carbon emissions that I talk about, those again are, since there's roughly 100 million tons of carbon being emitted by California's grid, you can almost look at those numbers there as percentage decreases. So that going along with those, you get that level of carbon reductions. And the percent of renewable energy curtailment, if you will, that is the energy that we have lost in order to balance the system, goes from essentially nothing up to roughly 10%. Next, please. This graph here, we're trying to show what energy gets displaced in going from 2020. That's on the left side, and then the energy that gets added. And as you can see, a little bit of coal throughout the West gets displaced as California adds all these renewables, but almost all of the displaced energy is gas. On the added energy side, you can see a mix that depends a lot, again, on this is the diverse portfolio, and that mix of adds is what is in this. Okay, so next, please. Next, yeah, thank you. California today, this we're looking at imports and exports into California. So back, please. I think we went to 2. So if we go, okay. This slide here, the gray line on top is, again, this is another one of those duration curves showing the quantities over the 8,760 hours out of the year. And the gray line is 2013 actual. And as you can see there, California imports, that's roughly 20 to 25% of the energy in California is imported. You can see that there's a few hours out there at the end in 8760 where things dip off, but that they never drop below almost 4,000 megawatts of imports. That happens on light load days in the spring and in the winter. During the summer, on the other hand, where you have the maximum, you can see that California is importing almost 20 gigawatts, or some 40% of its energy in a few hours. That tends to happen on hot summer days. And the other lines there are all of the cases that we're running for 2030. And the two things that you can see from this, number one, or three things. Number one is that going forward, that we are going, California, although still a net importer, is going to be importing significantly less than what it is today. And the second thing about that is that this trade, if you will, these imports, that almost none of those trades in 2030 are fossil, that the fossil imports essentially dry up. And again, if you remember, 1/3 of the coal fleet in the rest of WEC is retiring, and then the gas that is now being imported into California tends to stay home to serve load in Phoenix and Las Vegas and Albuquerque and Denver, and is not available to be exported into California. And then the third thing I would point out is that in many of these cases that we actually have physical exports from California. That's something that does not occur today, but there's no reason why it cannot. And there's good reason to say that many of those it's a very important consideration for that roughly 500,000 hours out of the year where we are physically exporting from California. That helps a lot in terms of keeping the cost down. Next, please. Now, this is another way of looking at that, and that is what we saw before were the physical imports. But what the renewables that we're adding from 2020 to 2030, there's a fair chunk of out-of-state wind that we're adding in this. There's a large assumption of a large build-out of wind in Wyoming and another large build-out of wind in New Mexico. And what happens is that there are times and there are hours in which California is in surplus, and it makes absolutely no sense to be importing anything, whether it's renewables, whether it's nuclear from Palo Verde, and certainly not fossil, at the same time that California is faced with a surplus and is looking to either curtail or try to re-export. So what happens in a dispatch going forward is some of that energy which has been contracted for to come into California and which is renewable is actually drop shipped or sold out of state to serve load out of state. And so those physical imports or physical exports from California that we talked about on the previous slide, even though physically those exports only occur in a few hours, in this slide you can see that maybe as much as 1/3 of the time California is actually selling some of its renewable energy out of state and never importing it. Or another way to look at it would be that maybe some of those Wyoming and New Mexico wind farms would be jointly owned by out-of-state interest and California interest, and that those California interest and out-of-state interest would be trading their entitled energy to make some sort of an optimum in this energy imbalance market going forward. Next, please. Now, Mark talked a little bit about ancillary services, and this is a very important thing going forward, that the source of those ancillary services, if we get them from fossil fuels, then we cannot achieve the levels of carbon reduction that we're talking about. That we have built a system which requires too much gas to operate in order to achieve the carbon reduction goals. So we have to get these ancillary services, which are absolutely necessary to have a reliable grid. We have to get those from these new renewables, or else we're not going to achieve our goals. So all of the things that Mark talked about that are possible, we're going to have to do that over the next 15 years, or we're not going to make it. So again, the green is the gas, and you can see there the contribution again of these conventional versus the enhanced flexibility, how important it is to minimize the size of the green and how important that is to the costs of operating the system and getting the carbon reductions that we talked about. Next, please.
Jim, this is Amanda, and I'm watching the time, and I want to be mindful of people's time and how long we said this webinar would run. So I just want to kind of give you a warning to wrap up so we still have some time for questions. Thank you.
I'm going to skip the next section entirely. I was going to do that anyway, but there's a lot of talk about the difficult days, and you hear a lot about the duck curve and all of these kinds of things. And this next section is just to show that it can happen and it can do it. But again, what's required is to get the flexibility in the contracts and in the business practices so that we can take advantage of the physical capability of the renewables to supply these things. So this next section, which I'll just skip it entirely, and I intended to anyway, is just there so that you know that we've looked at this. We've looked at it on a 5-minute basis, on an hourly basis. The steepest ramps come in the winter, and that's a 13,000 megawatt ramp that you see there. In the spring, we have over-generation in the middle of the day, and these eye charts look pretty wild. And what they mean, what they're saying is that the people in the control rooms, the people that are deciding these dispatch, are going to be pretty busy on those days. Now, this is a high-load day during the summer, and things look a lot more calm, if you will. So as long as there is enough resources, and sorry about the spelling of enhanced there, but as long as there are enough resources on the system, the summer, which historically has been the difficult days, are just go ahead and skip all these next charts here. This is looking for Department of Water and Power and some things. Okay, we did look at some sensitivities to these results. One of the things we were worried about is suppose the rest of the WEC has an aggressive renewable energy development as well. So we looked at a scenario where the rest of WEC went from roughly 18%, which is where they're headed today, to a 38% renewable energy development. And it didn't really change the results much for California, but it changed it a lot in the rest of the West. And that is clearly one way in which the rest of the West could achieve its Clean Power Plan obligations. We also looked at a study where coal was on the margin rather than gas. That means gas prices remain low, there's a high carbon price, so rather than backing down on gas when you want to dispatch, that we back down on coal. This scenario has, again, little impact on California because California is not importing almost no fossil energy no matter what, but there are major carbon reductions in the rest of the West. And again, those two scenarios really look at something that is beyond the Clean Power Plan compliance in the rest of the West, but we have studied those. We've also looked at drought, and again, these results are relatively robust in terms of dry and wet years for water. Next, please. Just real briefly here, we also, as I said, are looking past 2030, and the dotted lines look at a couple of trajectories as we go forward. And the red dot, if you remember, that says we operate the grid pretty much the way we do today. And what we're saying is that, okay, we can invest our way to buying a lot of new renewables, we can get down to the 2030 target, but if that's where we stay, if we don't change our ways And then from 2030 to 2050, as the other greenhouse gas reduction things in the transportation sector and in the building sector, and electrification of those to take fossil fuels out of those sectors result in an increased load from electricity, then the carbon emissions from the electric sector tend to go up right back to where we started. Again, the green dot there says that, okay, if we take those measures that we talked about and make those changes, which again are in our minds, in our human issues, not physical issues, and really not money issues, they're just human issues, then we can get a grid that can go past 2030. But again, about somewhere in the 2030, 2040s, we have to come up with something else other than this suite of things in order to get to the 80% reductions. Next, please. And these are the principal conclusions, that we can get to our goals. They're technically feasible with today's technology without significant rate impacts, that there's multiple paths with significant different costs to get to these 2030, that the conventional flexibility will get there, but it costs more. If you remember, we're talking about $1 billion a year more cost than just doing what we can with what we have. And then that final thing there is a list of the critical components of enhanced flexibility. And the only comment I'll make in closing is that these critical components, that we need to start working on this list now, that we need to get to this enhanced flexibility before we spend $50 billion on new renewables, or else we're going to have problems, we're going to have friction, and we're going to, so the message that we're trying to give in this low carbon grid study is that we can't wait, that we need to start working on these changes today in order to make this cost-effective transition, or this transition cost-effective in 2030, or to make it at all past 2030. Okay? Yeah. So with that, I'll answer questions from here.
Sounds good. Everybody, we are 5 minutes past the hour where we said we would end. And I appreciate everybody's attendance. We're going to take a couple questions. So if you need to drop off, please do so. But I'm going to take some of the questions that are on the chat box, as well as some of the other ones that have come in. So for, I think, Jim and Mark, this questioner says, you discuss capabilities of wind to provide frequency, voltage control, and ancillary services. How do you provide these when the wind stops blowing? Do you need to overbuild wind? Does geographic diversity take care of them? Could you please elaborate?
Oh, sure. I can take a start at that. I mean, obviously, geographic diversity, especially if you are talking about all of the West, all the WECC, helps a lot because you know, it's very uncommon for there to not be some wind, you know, from some source at any given point in time. But it's not the case either that you expect that you're going to get 100% of these services all from wind or all from solar or all from anything for that matter. You know, it's the diversity of the whole fleet and some of the other flexibility that Jim mentioned, you know, such as the use of storage or other new developments as well. You know, so you have to look at it as a system optimization as a whole and not depending on one resource. For example, we can't get it all from just that one plant, you know, in a conventional sense either, because at any instant in time that plant could be offline. It could have a forced outage and not be there anymore. You know, so it really is an overall system optimization, and you have to look at it that way. And it's not a requirement that, you know, you'd be able to do it all with wind.
Great, thank you, Jim.
I was going to say, if you also look at solar and you think about solar, clearly east, west, north, south, you get large things. You get 2 time zones. That's huge in terms of dealing with that midday burst of energy from the solar. And you've got, you know, the 1,200, 1,500 miles south to north. So again, and as Mark said, though, when we talk about diversity, we mean not only geographic diversity, but technical diversity. But it really does matter that what we're talking about going forward in the world that we're headed towards, that it's the portfolio that matters. This idea of wind integration or solar integration or integration cost adders or treating these things as silos and treating them as individual resources and talking about how much the integration cost adder for wind or solar is really an obsolete concept that only works below roughly 1/3. As long as the renewables are less than 1/3 of the resources on the system, then you can think about it that way. But as soon as you get into this environment where you're 30 to 50 to 60% renewables, then you have to treat it as a portfolio, not as an individual resource, and that portfolio needs to be diverse both geographically and technically.
Okay, and Jim, this question for you. What does the interior West states need to do to work with California to achieve California's goals and to expand the deployment of renewables in those interior West states? Because everybody looks to California and says, we want to sell there. So they're looking for some guidance on how do we help California meet its goals?
Well, I think that's right. And you know, as I say, historically, we've always, and by we, I mean both us and California and the folks in the interior West, have viewed California as a sink that only imported, and that all of the issues surrounding that. What we're saying here is that going forward, it's robust trade. It's not just imports. It's imports and exports, and it's cooperation, you know, going forward. And the first thing that has to happen, first of all, is just the visibility in real time. That you have to be able to see these things with enough granularity and enough specificity that you can actually act on them. And in my view, the energy imbalance market that is started up, you know, between the Pacific Core and the California ISO, and is due to expand to Arizona, Nevada, the Pacific Northwest over the next 2 years, that's hugely important because it gets all of this up where people can see it in enough time to be able to do something about it, and it provides them a place to park the little differences between what they want to do, you know, ahead and what actually happens in real time. So it allows things to be financially settled, but it also allows that visibility that then you can plan around. So the first thing I think that has to happen is that energy imbalance market just simply has to go, or you can't get here. On the other hand, I don't think it's absolutely necessary that you could go all the way. You don't have to think about going to a West-wide RTO. You don't have to give up your religion. That may happen, it may not down the road, but we shouldn't be, I think, focused on that as a necessity. But we do have to have that energy imbalance market.
Great. Okay. I have 3 more questions, and my clock says it's 11 after 2, but I'm going to just go ahead and ask these, and hopefully we'll wrap up here in about 10 minutes. And if you need to drop off, greatly appreciate you attending, and I want to thank Mark and Jim for their time and their substantial expertise on these issues. So one of the questions that came in from a couple different people is, who would you put up as good examples where people could go study who is doing the best job at getting the ancillary and other services from wind and other renewables? Like Mark mentioned Quebec, Hydro-Quebec. Are there entities that you point to say, you know, these guys are really doing it right?
I guess I would answer that. I think ERCOT in Texas is doing a pretty good job. I think the other places to watch for this, one is Hawaii, where you know they are already out in this regime today, and they're struggling with all of this and trying to figure it out. And what we can learn from Hawaii, I think, is something that is really going to be important, not just for them, but also for us. So Hawaii is a good place to watch. Germany is clearly a good place to watch. They're somewhat ahead of us in terms of trying to get there. They don't have nearly the meteorological resources that we have. In other words, the sun doesn't shine real well, and in many cases the wind doesn't blow as well as us. So we actually have it a lot easier than Germany, but they're going to happen. Ireland is another place as an island which is struggling with these issues today. I don't know, Mark, whether you can think of other places.
No, those are really good examples. You know, like Ireland is a great case of, you know, and Hawaii. All of the various regions in the country, though, are wrestling with this right now. You know, none of them are perfect, but as you say, you know, some of the stuff going on in Texas and the ERCOT region is quite impressive, and they're really completely redesigning their ancillary services markets now along the lines that Jim mentioned, because they see this coming and they know they're going to have to, you know, assign value to more than just energy, so that they get all the resources cooperating in this way.
Okay, great. Are there other studies similar to what you've done for California for the entire WECC or other WECC states?
We're talking about them. I'm not. There is some studies that have been done that are somewhat relevant to this question, like the Western Wind and Solar Integration studies that were conducted by NREL, which were more technical in nature than policy related that we're talking about here. But clearly, I think with the Clean Power Plan and Clean Power Plan compliance coming up, that there's several people who are talking about doing this kind of thing for the rest of WECC. We're one of those people that we're talking about trying to do something next year to make this WECC-wide. I would also say, though, again, that our study, this low carbon grid study, even though it's focused on California, it really does include all the rest of the WECC. And we have gotten probably 90% of the stuff, and one of the things that we're going to be doing is trying to sort of flip the results so that we can look at results in the rest of the WECC at the same kind of level that we're looking at in California without doing a whole bunch of new modeling.
Okay, great. There's one more technical question that I'm going to skip and let that person ask Jim directly when he sees him sometime, but the other person has asked whether the presentations will be made available today, and the answer is yes, that on the Four Corners Wind Resource Center page, if you go into resources, we actually have all our past webinars, and we have had some fabulous technical experts, so I commend that site to everyone for additional information. So I want to wrap it up here.
I was going to say, I forgot to give our website.
Go ahead.
That's lowcarbongrid2030.org. Lowcarbongrid, all lowercase, no spaces, 2030.org. These phase 2 results will be posted Wednesday of this week.
Great.
In all their gory detail. And certainly call me if you want to follow up on anything.
So thank you, Jim, very much, and Mark, thank you for your time, and thank you, everybody, for your attendance. Look for these on the website.